Professor, Doctor, this is already on?
Yes.
Now? Is that right?
So, which country you come from? Quel pays vous venez? Which country you come from?
Du Kenya.
Huh?
Du Kenya.
Kenya?
Mm.
Oh, okay. Very good. You also from Kenya?
No, Algérie.
Algeria. How about you?
I'm from Congo.
Oh, from Sri Lanka.
Okay.
Okay.
යාගේ ෆෝන් එක දැම්මද කො? එරිකා යාගේ ෆෝන් එක මොකද කරේ? ඒකේ මේ ඔෆ් කරන්න ඕනේ මේ එයාප්ලේන් මොඩේ දාන්න.
Got ඇවිල්ලා කරන්නේ.
සම්පූර්ණ.
පටන් ගන්න වෙලාව හරි. හරි. නෙක්ස්ට් දාගන්න. එන්න පටන්.
පොඩින්ද?
Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the side event organized by the Global Sri Lanka Forum Executive Committee with the African Green Foundation. We are going to talk about the war, reconciliation and human rights in Sri Lanka. Today we have 4 speakers. To my left side is Mr. Teni Fernando. He's attorney at law. He studied in Sri Lanka and in United Kingdom. And we have also Mr. Malinda Serviratna. He was an editor of one of the most circulating newspapers in Sri Lanka, but now he is working as a freelance journalist. To my right-hand side, Mr. Brian Basnaika. He is living in Switzerland for a long time. He is well known among Sri Lankan community in Switzerland. He is a social worker and he is a community worker. I like also to introduce to you our friend, Sri Lankan friend of Sri Lanka. He is from Turkey, Prof.h.c. Dr. Mohammed. He's been working with us since long time, and also he's nominated to the Nobel Peace Prize 3 times, including this time. So I don't take much time. I like to give the floor to Mr. Teni Fernando.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The given task for me today is UN resolution and the impact on national security in Sri Lanka. Let me just elaborate a little background for this topic. Sri Lanka had been a victim of transnational colonization since 1505. Ever since, the national public policy and the legal system tremendously went through ups and downs with influence of Western culture and Western flavors. After independence in 1948 from the British monarchy, Sri Lanka drastically changed its course of direction towards a unitary state where all racial and ethnic identities were respected and their rights enshrined by law. Sri Lanka had been in a complex history where civil war against Tiger Tamil terrorism, and then we had political, economic and social cultural tensions against the backdrop of ethnic division, which has generated tremendous security challenges. Indeed, for last 3 decades, the majority Sinhalese government faced an armed uprising among large segment of marginalized and disfranchised Tamil population due to separatist activities led by Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam, commonly known as LTTE. Sri Lankan government enhancing security measures with tri-forces, civil defense forces and police forces extend the defensive and offensive missions capturing LTT terrorists and eliminating them until their leader is dead in 2009. The security measures and techniques used by military forces were nothing uncommon to the common world in the present day, but used with them with extreme professionalism and courage to defeat terrorism in 2009. Now, we all have to understand what is national security. The national security of a country, a sovereign country, is the ability to preserve the nation's physical and territorial integrity, to maintain its economic relations with the rest of the world on reasonable terms, to preserve its nature, institutions, and governance from outside and control its borders. So, the today's topic that I am interested to speak of is how UN resolutions have impact the national security of Sri Lanka. Now, more importantly, there had been 2 important resolutions that passed after post-war situation in Sri Lanka that started 2009. That is one resolution 30/1 and the other resolution is 34/1. So basically, the United Nations Human Rights Commission in 2015 passed the first resolution which had a huge impact on national security of Sri Lanka, co-sponsored by Sri Lanka. With this resolution, it is undoubtedly the purpose was to look into the matters prevailing at that time, especially in respect of alleged human rights violation occurred in the last phase of war. However, with that resolution, the UN wanted us to investigate into certain other matters and enter into territory where infringe the state sovereignty. And if I may state, one of the terms or paragraph in that resolution 30/1, it says as follows. Paragraph 8 says, also encourages the government of Sri Lanka to introduce effective security sector reforms as part of its transitional justice process, which will help to enhance the reputation and professionalism of the military and include ensuring that no scope exists for retention in or recruitment into the security forces or anyone credibly implicated through a fair administrative process in serious crime involving human rights violation or abuse or violation of international humanitarian law, including member of the security and the intelligence units, and also to increase training and incentives focused on the promotion and the protection of human rights of all Sri Lanka. Now, the situation now in Sri Lanka is affected due to this UN resolution. Why I say that? Now, as you all know, recently there had been an attack, a suicide bomb attack in Sri Lanka, that is on Easter Sunday, where several places of Sri Lanka, including 3 Catholic churches, were blasted, or suicide bombers came and blasted themselves, killing over 250 people. Now, how this happened? Because we had been defending Sri Lanka, we had been fighting with one of the most dangerous terrorist organizations known to the world at that time, LTTE, and we managed to eliminate them from our soil. physically. But how, after 9 years, how could another attack from a different terrorist organization carried out in Sri Lanka soil? Now, where did this security had their defect? To identify that, this resolution that was passed in 2015 had an impact. That was, the Sri Lankan government co-sponsored this resolution. By doing that, they had to implement certain things to comply with the resolution, and one of them was to bring certain intelligence officers and tri-armed force officers to justice for alleged offences, because there had been so many allegations against army officers, police officers, and intelligence officers for certain offences that they have alleged to have been committed. And what happened was, over 35 intelligence officers were taken into custody by the government, and they were produced before the judicial institutions and then remanded. But up to date, there had been no conviction. There had been no conviction passed against any of them. And apart from that, there had been many number of military officers, navy officers, army officers were taken into custody. And up to date, there had been no conviction other than certain offences committed by not as military officers but as a civilian had been taken into court and convicted. So the problem lies on that the government of Sri Lanka crippled its own security in order to comply with certain guidelines passed by UNHRC. And for whatever the reasons that the government had up to date, they wanted to comply with this resolution, even though most of the countrymen want the other way around. And the next reason that I see that we failed in our national security is that the UN resolution passed in 2015, 3/1, wanted us to reconsider, review, repeal or replace the Prevention of Terrorism Act of Act number 48 of 1979, Amendment Act number 10 of 1982, and 22 of 1998. So the UN thought and UN reviewed the existing Prevention of Terrorism Act, and they recommended certain provisions in the Prevention of Terrorism Act as contrary to accepted international norms and human rights laws and humanitarian laws. And therefore, they keep on pressurizing the government of Sri Lanka to review and repeal and not to implement the provisions contained in Prevention of Terrorism Act. And if I come to this Easter attack, we did not fail in ascertaining information about this attack and who did this attack. And we all know that it was an Muslim extremist group carried out this attack in affiliation with ISIS. Now this group had been propagated in the country from so many years, and the government of Sri Lanka had the information that there had been an organization trying to raise and take arms and try to attack some part of Sri Lanka. However, in the name of reconciliation and in the name of bending down the terms of UN, HRC, we did not take action. We did not implement the existing prevention of terrorism law in Sri Lanka because we wanted reconciliation than preventing a crime, preventing an attack. That is because we had to bow down and we had to undertake to implement the UN HRC terms more than the national security. So I say UNHRC resolution, especially 30/1, and thereafter the special rapporteur's report submitted in 2017, and the problem is Prevention of Terrorism Act. Why we have Prevention of Terrorism Act with the rigorous provisions other than what are existing in the other part of the world? But I would like to say we fought the world's biggest terrorism with those provisions, with professionalism, with courage, and without Prevention of Terrorism Act, I doubt we can manage any further or any upcoming terrorist attack without such rigorous provisions, because terrorism nothing that we can control without rigorous actions taken against it. And UNHRC talks about Sri Lanka, but they don't want to look at what are the provisions in USA and in UK. And when UK and the British soldiers were accused of certain allegation in Iraq, and there the Premier, and she said, I quote, the Prime Minister spoke of pride in the UK armed forces and praised the work they do to keep our nation safe. She said that every effort must be made to prevent an abuse of the legal system, and restated a determination to protect the armed forces against any instance of vexation complaints. So they do anything to defend their forces and their actions, and yet they support resolution of this nature against Sri Lanka. So this double standard, I must say, we should not allow UNHRC to work on any further. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Teni Fernando. The next speaker will be Mr. Malinda Seneviratna.
Thank you, Eric. Now, I have to talk about the rise of extremism / terrorism in Sri Lanka. As Teni said, the overall context is about 30 years of terrorism which we had to go through. But we're talking about 10 years after the end of that military victory and the recent rise of extremist attacks. Now, when people write about or talk about extremism in Sri Lanka, very strangely, especially over the last few weeks, talk about the fears and anxieties, which are real, by the way, of minority communities, especially Muslims. It's almost as if on the 21st of April 2019, Easter Sunday, 179 children did not lose a parent or both parents. It's as though over 250 people were not killed. It's as though over 500 people were not wounded in 3 suicide attacks on churches and 3 suicide attacks on high-end tourist hotels. Now, how did that happen? Was it that half a dozen, 10 people, a dozen people got together suddenly and decided, okay, tomorrow let's go bomb some people? This has a history. It has a long history, a history that predates some of now we all know that extremism feed off each other, and fingers have been pointed often at extreme Buddhist organizations. In fact, the entire Sinhala Buddhist community is talked in homogeneous terms, even when people say all Muslims are not terrorists, all Muslims are not the same, which is true. There are no homogeneous communities. People are differentiated, but that differentiation principle is selectively applied. So, how did this happen? In this the rise of the National Tawhid Jamaat movement, its origins go back to the beginning of this millennium, the beginning of this century. That it has been a long process whereby a few people all of a sudden began to interpret the Quran literally. Now there is nothing wrong in that. Anyone can interpret anything any way they like, but when that interpretation includes a selective quoting of a selective drawing of tenets in the Quran, and a very literal one at that, it makes for a very dangerous kind of outcome. This came, we can clearly say, with the rise of Wahhabism in Sri Lanka. That is not something that is a response to some other kind of extremism in Sri Lanka, real or imagined. And not all Muslims are guilty of that. In fact, the first attacks by this particular group were directed against mainstream Muslim communities. The Sufis, for centuries, there have been no problems between Sinhalese and Muslims, or Muslims or Catholics. The churches attacked were Catholics, the Catholic institutions. Now, when you talk about minority rights and extremism, it's a difficult thing to put one against the other. I think it's not that where that these two things are always at odds against each other. Now, we do have religious freedom. Now, if you want to talk about the situation in Sri Lanka compared to other countries, very simple thing. See how many religious holidays Sri Lankans have, as opposed to secular countries in Europe. Sri Lanka is officially a supposed to have special privileges for Buddhism, the Article 9, which have been effectively negated in Articles 14 and 10. If you want to look at holidays, there were 49 Buddhist holidays 30 years ago. Now there are 13. There are just 3 holidays for Hindus, 4, and for Muslims, if you take all the privileges, Ramadan and special holidays of maternity leave, divorce for widows and so on, they have more holidays than Buddhist holidays. And as for Christians, there are at least 54 holidays. Every Sunday is a Christian holiday. But I mean, let us not be as simplistic as that. Where we are in a situation where we affirm the universal tenets pertaining to religious freedoms. Now, what do we do in a country where a certain group of people use religion as think of religion as affirming that faith is, there's no problem in affirming that faith and in killing people. When you take, the Bible is full of such things, the Quran is full of such, but not everyone really takes things out of context. You don't have problems with the Catholics and Christians from whatever denomination. There are the Old Testament, the New Testament, you can just Google and find out. But when a certain group affirms their faith in this way, what do you do? What does that say about religious rights? Now, the answer cannot be forget religious freedom. The answer cannot be forget minority rights. But the answer has to take into account the context and has to rethink laws, and in terms of the current situation, we have to think about issues of security, because at the end of the day, it's about all citizens. The attacks killed people from all communities. So we are in a very, very strange situation where some people say terrorism has no religion. True, partly, because all the people who were engaged in those acts of terrorism affirmed their faith. They were affirming their faith on Easter Sunday, and for them to kill people, the non-believers, is part of affirming that faith. So we have to talk about, maybe in our discussion later on, we can talk about how such issues have come to the fore, and what we need to do in a country that is trying desperately to rebuild after years of largely unnecessary confrontation between two. On the ground in Sri Lanka, I would like to add this finally. There are no issues between ordinary Sinhalese and ordinary Tamils today. There are grievances which have been addressed and some that need to be addressed, but there are grievances that every community also has. Right.
Thank you, Melinda. The next speaker is Mr. Brian Basnaik.
Mr. Chairman, gentlemen, and ladies. Excuse me. Anyway, I'm supposed to speak on about the effectiveness of the UNHRC resolutions pertaining to Sri Lanka as well as international. The United Nations organization came into being at the end of a debilitating world war that resulted in an unprecedented loss of lives in many parts of the globe and massive destruction of property and infrastructure in Europe and parts of Africa and Asia, including Japan. It was the genuine intention of the victors of the World War II to form an international organization endowed with the right kind of mechanism to bring about a world order that ensured peace and security to all nations, big and small. It was the organization that they intended to replace the League of Nations, formed after World War II, that failed comprehensively to prevent the outbreak of the Second World War. Unlike the League of Nations, the UNO has survived through 7 decades of armed conflicts between various member states and within individual states, assorted territorial disputes, superpower contentions including the Cold War, and major natural disasters in member states. There were other violations of its charter by certain member states. The list will go on, and I don't want to get into that. But somehow the UNO has remained strong and firm to withstand them all. It is to the credit of the organization that, regardless of the distractions from its critics and opponents, it has managed to limit the conflicts and the ensuing suffering and destructions, and in the end ensure the engagement of the disputants through dialogue, adjudication or mediation for a peaceful resolution. Indeed, it is this organization, only this organization with its imperfections and limitations, that we have to ensure a world order that functions for the greater good of all humanity, and those are the states wherein they live and wish to live in peace and with dignity as free and equal human beings. As with all small states on this earth, Sri Lanka, an island strategically and opportunely located in the Indian Ocean, must inescapably rely on the multilateral system of the UNO, especially if it is to avoid domination by not only powerful neighbors, but also even more assertive world powers from further afield. Particularly in these times when powerful nations in the West are increasingly turning to unilateral action against weaker nations in the developing world, in blatant disregard to the fundamental principles of the UNO Charter, some nations can only hope that the UNO will be a bastion to protect their right to sovereignty, non-interference in their internal affairs, and peaceful coexistence with their neighbors. As so often is the case, in the guise of defending human rights, Western powers interfere or even intervene in the internal affairs of smaller nations in the developing world, precisely to assert their power and their narrow political and economic interests. The majority of the people of Sri Lanka is becoming increasingly frustrated and disappointed with the United Nations as the once immovable bastion for the protection of human rights and the sovereign rights of every nation in all parts of the world. Sadly, it is now shedding its neutrality and duty to protect small nations against the aggression and intimidation of the world powerful states. The Sri Lankan experience. The questionable neutrality of the UN is best illustrated in some of the activities of the United Nations Human Rights Council. In this regard, its dealings with Sri Lanka indicate its bias towards the Western powers' volition rather than the collective interests of the people of Sri Lanka, irrespective of their gender, ethnicity, or religious affiliations. The resolution 30/1 of the UNHRC is doubtless full of noble intentions, but unfortunately it is riddled with anomalies that will eventually lead to the very opposite outcome that it purportedly intends to avoid: the integrity of the sovereign state of Sri Lanka. People of Sri Lanka, by all accounts, genuinely care about human rights and the need to protect them from all the communities and regions in Sri Lanka. Discrimination and denial of rights of minorities remain a problem not only in Sri Lanka, but almost in every country in the world, including the US and the UK. People of Sri Lanka are aware of the shortcomings, but they are genuinely minded to improve conditions and ensure the upholding of the fundamental rights of all minorities at all times and everywhere on the island. Sri Lanka needs the space, economic, social, legal, cultural, and spiritual, to develop the required mechanisms and capacities speedily to perpetuate adherence to the fundamental rights of all her citizens. Not least of all is Sri Lanka in need of the majority of the people to engage in the discourse and the search for the mechanisms to perpetuate respect for the rights of all people, as enshrined in the beautiful precepts of the Buddha Dhamma. This is not to disregard in any way the fundamental precepts of all other great religions of the world. I'm just using Buddhism as the majority religions. The people of Sri Lanka are also profoundly concerned with the envisaged political remedies in the light of the UNHCR resolutions and recommendations. Fundamental to their wishes is the integrity of the nation, the continuation of its unitary status with guaranteed protection and support to all minorities and regions. However, the approach taken by the UNHRC will only drive a wedge between the communities in the long run and undermine not only reconciliation but also lead to the eventual rise of separatism once again and, alas, the final division of the country. The people of Sri Lanka are keenly aware of and also gravely concerned with the developments in the United Kingdom and the Kingdom of Spain. The evolution in those countries has not gone according to plan, and of course, due to various reasons, the breakup of the United Kingdom and the secession of Catalonia from Spain is increasingly becoming a reality. In that context, introducing a federal system to Sri Lanka will not only be foolhardy, but also it will be vehemently opposed by a vast majority of the people and most sections of the society. One of the most repugnant but perhaps unintended consequences of the pressures exerted by UNHRC resolutions is the leverage given to Western powers to extract commercial and military concessions from not so resilient governments and equally weak leaders in the developing countries. The credibility of the UNHRC resolution 3/1 is never more under scrutiny than right now after the Easter Sunday massacres in Sri Lanka. After almost 10 years of peace and budding tranquility, Sri Lanka woke up to the realities of security failures and political ineptitude. An administration orchestrated by the West and guided by the UNHRC dismantled the highly effective security setup of the previous government, allowing the terrorists to perpetrate carnage. Then the administration abysmally failed to handle the immediate aftermath of the massacres appropriately, but for the swift and highly effective actions of the Sri Lankan armed forces and specialist units of the Sri Lanka police force, further acts of terror and carnage that were planned to follow could have been even worse. Let me, I've made this a longer version, but let me very quickly wind up by mentioning that the international experience, it is not the intention here to condemn the UNHRC roundly and wholesale. The UNHRC has played an important role globally and selectively. However, in its admission, the Council has deep-seated problems. Despite these positive trends at the Council, it says, the HRC 40 also revealed a number of dark clouds on the horizon, warning signs that, if left unaddressed, may presage a future breakdown in trust amongst delegations and the decline of the Council's fortunes. The paramount lesson in the history of the Council and of its predecessor, UNHRC, is that it tends to align with the Western powers and neglect its duty to protect the interests of the smaller and weaker nations. The UN in general perpetuates the divisions of the world according to the power and wealth of the individual member states as well as collective powers or regional blocs, such as NATO, OSCE, and OECD and the like. UNHRC therefore follows the dictates of the Western powers to the detriment of the poorer nations and their interests. The twin forces of the international monetary system, governed by the US, and the military alliances controlled by the US and its European allies, will work in tandem to keep developing countries in line with the objectives of the Western powers. The UN, IMF, and the World Bank are but instruments of the West's hegemony of the world order. Sri Lanka, through its fate of its proximity to India and its location in the path of the vital sea lanes, is increasingly becoming a pawn in regional politics with the attempts of the US to create a military hub on the island. The SOFA agreements, that's the Status of Forces Agreement, envisage the takeover of large tracts of land for US agencies with total legal and economic control under US law. It will, by design, lead to an eventual dismemberment of the country and virtual serfdom of Sri Lankans, particularly in the south. Large sections of the people of Sri Lanka are in almost mortal fear of the US as an existential threat to themselves, their beloved country, and their cherished culture. The US was once considered a friend, but often viewed with suspicion, and lately it is seen as the harbinger of total annihilation.
Thank you, Brian.
Thank you.
Thank you. The last speaker for the day is Dr. Prof.h.c. Please.
Dear Mr. Eric and dear Chairman, many thanks. And I would like to speak last because I speak too much, and please inform me to
10 minutes.
10 minutes. Welcome everybody. I mean, this building is an interesting place because if you say that nobody has a right to kill civilians, your life can be in danger and you can get that race inside this building. It's a really interesting issue because in fact in the dirty politics of United Nations till 1994 during the Cold War, some national liberation movements or self-identified national liberation movements identified themselves to give a right to kill civilians. Until 1994 it is not in fact forbidden in the UN system. And this policy still tries to go on. And what I would say is that here the UN human rights body is a victim-based approach, and we should act for the justice and for the victim-based approach. And moreover, if we say that it's like a restaurant, this is not a la carte restaurant. You can go and choose something from the menu, and you want to do it as a politics. No, this is a fixed menu restaurant. You are obliged all the systems of the UN. And in fact, this side event, when we talk about Sri Lanka, we are not in fact talking about Sri Lanka. We are talking about the ideas and principles of the UN Charter and all the human rights obligations. When we go on, I would like to go on only the part of reconciliation for Sri Lanka, but we have got a limited time. I will talk about the legality of the Norwegian peace process, because we have got in the past experience of Norwegian peace process, but Norwegian peace process is null and void in the UN system. This is the important point. When some actions are trying to be politicized and legitimized by the Norwegian peace process, Norwegian peace process is null and void. In fact, it's a threat to world peace and security. This is an important point. Why? We have got the Sierra Leone peace agreement, and by the UN Security Council Resolution 1315, 1999, it is said that the amnesty provisions are not accepted. Now, there is a gap in the system of what is called humanitarian space, how to make communication with the non-state armed actors, designated as terrorists, and the state. Because in general, we are not talking about Sri Lanka, we are talking about the legality of the Norwegian peace process, and if anybody tries to get a legitimization for the acts of violence by using the Norwegian peace process, this is the important point. So this is a threat to world peace and security. We are not talking about Sri Lanka now. I mean, while we are here, General Comment 29 for the conventional civil rights and political rights, we are here to protect right to life, and no derogation can be accepted on the actions against life. This is the Chicago's work. If you don't have the protection of right to life, this building has no meaning. And when we go on the problem how to make peace, there can be not legal dialogues or different kind of dialogues. But when it is a policy of the non-state armed group, especially killing civilians, and when you do not define them as terrorists, we mentioned the Eastern Church attacks, but Tamil Tigers killed hundreds of Muslims in the mosque and praying. And here they say that we are not terrorists. What is the difference of ISIS and the LTT killing the people in a praying place, church or mosque? And if you do not define LTT as a terrorist, now it's a religious discrimination. You cannot define ISIS as well a criminal organization. Then representative of ISIS will come to this building and they will ask for an independent Islamic state. This is legitimized in the UN system. What I would like to say is that I've got limited time. For the reconciliation, not the legitimization of the actions on the political point of the Norwegian peace process, we must put something, because Norwegian report on by themselves, they said that we do not put in standards. This is the important point. I would like to read something from the special reporter on extrajudicial summary or arbitrary executions, Philip Olson, on Sri Lanka, 2006, in his report, paragraph 25. Human rights law affirms that both the government and the LTTE must respect the rights of every person in Sri Lanka. Human rights norms operate in three levels: as the rights of individuals, as obligations assumed by states, and as legitimate expectations of the international community. The government has assumed the binding legal obligation to respect and ensure the rights recognized in the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights. As a non-state actor, the LTT does not have legal obligations under International Convention on Civil and Political Rights, but it remains subject to the demand of the international community, first expressed in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that every organ of the society respect and promote. It is the report in paragraph 25, 2006. And I will go on. The LTT should refrain from violating human rights, including those of non-LTT affiliated Tamil civilians. This includes in particular respect for the rights of freedom of expression, peaceful assembly, freedom of association with others, family life, and the democratic participation, including the right to vote. The LTT should especially affirm that it will be about the arts and other thing. So this is paragraph 85. But what we see is that LTT is not a legitimized representative of the Tamil nation in Sri Lanka. They've got the arm, and they do not give any rights for the Tamil civilians or the Muslims. They make expulsion of 75,000 Muslims, and this was ethnic cleansing, and this is a crime against humanity, and no derogation must be given, and it must be criminalized. And the Human Rights Council, by its resolutions, when they do not implement UN Global Counter-Terrorism Strategy for Sri Lanka, and do not ask for an international criminal investigation for the finance of terrorism, it's the last resolution for the /R. It's an international wrongful act of an international organization, unfortunately. So I've got limited time, but what we talk here, in fact, we do not talk about Sri Lanka. We talk about how to create peace for the reconciliation process with the ideals and principles of the UN Charter. With the Norwegian peace process, we do not know how the Tamil nation, I mean, some people can have a professional life of representative of an organization and making news, but what is the situation on the ground? They are used as a human shield. I mean, the interesting point is that when there is a administrative, when a territory is occupied by a non-state armed group, it doesn't need to be a signature for the Geneva Conventions. It's an obligation automatically coming because it's protecting right to life. It's a customary international law. Freedom of expression, all their rights to be implemented. They do not need to be signed in a treaty. It's not a legal recognition. But the main principles of life, if a non-state armed group occupied a territory and not binding any human rights treaties, this is wrong. And what UN Human Rights Council Resolution 40/1 makes another wrong thing. And in this special rapporteur, what expressed is the right thing. I'm talking about the special rapporteur in the UN system. And this is the wrong part of the Norwegian peace process. It legitimizes all the human rights violations of LTT. Last thing is that at the last stage of the war, when there is a conflict, it is the international humanitarian law. But when there is no fighting goes on in the Norwegian peace process, when the guns stop, also human rights treaty obligations are as obligation for the non-state armed groups. We are not speaking of Sri Lanka. Think about Libya, Syria, Central African Republic, all the civil wars, and the places are administrated by non-state armed groups. If we legitimize LTT, we will legitimize all the human rights violations in these states. So we are not talking about Sri Lanka. We are talking about the principles that to protect right to life and all the human rights. Thank you very much, Chairman.
Thank you, Professor and Dr. Mohammed. Now we have allocated time for Q&A, questions and answers. If you have any questions, please, this is the time for that.
Only lady will ask the question.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
This is from Dr. Mohammed. Do you elaborate a little bit more about criminalizing what the last you just mentioned it about financing terrorism?
I mean, okay.
But the UN system doesn't seem to be taking that very seriously.
I mean, unfortunately, there is a gap in the UN system. There is a New York Accord of the Security Council and Geneva. It's in fact in a body. And first, when we fight in terrorism, we must protect everybody's right and not criminalize the people. And unfortunately, it's very easily some people use terrorism laws against any people who tries to protect their rights. But we have got a very simple thing. If the actions are against systematically killing of civilians, there is terrorism. There is no other definition. Because the actions are well defined of terrorism. When you put a bomb, when you kill 2 presidents, when you kill Muslims in mosques, when you make ethnic cleansing to the Muslims, you are a terrorist organization. There is not a problem of the definition of terrorism. They are well defined in the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court and in the UN Global Counterterrorism Strategy and the Geneva Conventions. But the problem, why I say that the criminalization of finance of terrorism in Sri Lanka, you enter CIA fact book sheet and you can see that LTT is still earning $300 to $400 million yearly. And they are under the definition of narco-terrorism. Where is this money going for the last 9 years? It makes some billions of dollars. And in the past, it is written, just search LTT, Al-Qaeda, you can see that they bought stolen Norwegian passports. So there is a relation. Maybe ISIS this time used their people because you can easily find people in the name of religion to die and to blow themselves up. I will just come to the position. In the UN Global Counterterrorism Strategy, it's an obligation to preventive measures. And if LTT is still collecting funds in the cocaine business, and here you can get that trace, it's still illegal. And as a preventive measures, Human Rights Council should ask an international criminal investigation for the finance of terrorism, but can come to another point, because the decisions of Human Rights Council is not binding and the General Assembly is thing, but it can send this demand to General Assembly to ask for the UN Security Council. So this is an obligation for the preventive measures to protect right to life in Sri Lanka. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mohammed. Are there any other questions, please? looks like there are no other questions. So Global Sri Lanka Forum Executive Committee and the African Green Foundation International would like to thank you very much for your attendance today. This is the last day of the 41st session of the UNHRC. I hope you will go back safe home and we'll see you on the 42nd session. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Today's session is finished and we can complete our session update the Human Rights Council.
Day by day, some politicians in the United Kingdom, they want to make economic sanctions to Syria. And these bombings, because 3 bombings were to church, 3 for the hotels, tourism economy also. And it's a massive revolution.
Until then, so thank you very much for watching.
Thank you, Melinda. Laptop ko na lang yan ang balas wala.